All right. Thank you. Well, thank you for coming. And in case you didn't know, we are celebrating Crime Victim Rights Week nationwide this week. And no better day for us to do something like what we're doing today, announcing Wisconsin's initiative to pass Marsy's Law for Wisconsin. And I'm very proud to stand here with some brave survivors of crime, along with some law enforcement leaders and some legislators who've been great allies, and some great allies like Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault. We have an important announcement. I want to start by prefacing this a little bit with Wisconsin's history. Wisconsin has a proud tradition. We had the first Crime Victim Services Division in a DA's office in America in Milwaukee County quite a few years ago. I don't remember when that was. In 1980, we passed the nation's first Victim Bill of Rights. In 1993, Wisconsin passed our constitutional amendment that added some of the rights of crime victims to our Wisconsin Constitution. Most importantly, from law enforcement officers to district attorneys, to victim witness specialists, to our Office of Crime Victim Services, to our State Crime Victim Rights Board, we have some of the best people in the country working hard to protect the rights of crime victims. But we can do more. And what we're here to talk about today is really a natural progression of Wisconsin's proud history. We work through Marsy's Law for Wisconsin, we can create truly equal rights for Wisconsin crime victims. We want to do this in a way, by a method that I don't take lightly, amending the Wisconsin Constitution. That's a big deal, and we should not do it for just anything. However, our proposal, Marsy's Law for Wisconsin, will update our Constitution to make sure all rights victims deserve are clear, enforceable constitutional rights. The need will be shown clearly from the brave survivors who will talk today. We've learned a lot in the 20 plus years since we passed our prior constitutional amendment for crime victims. But the legislation that DOJ helped draft and that is authored by Representatives Novak and Senator Weingard will apply those lessons we've learned to our state constitution. Many of the rights in Marsy's Law are currently in state statute, but that doesn't hold up alongside a defendant's constitutional rights. We want to make sure we make a more even playing field. Of course, a defendant's constitutional right to a fair trial will always have to be the lead in a courtroom. But by changing the victim's rights to constitutional rights, we give the judge the ability to make a decision that weighs the victim's rights more heavily than we have currently. I've seen firsthand as a prosecutor for more than 25 years now how impactful crime victim rights can be. But I'm going to let others here who are far more qualified to talk about this further. And with that, I want to first introduce Representative Todd Novak.
Thank you, Attorney General Schimel, for your leadership and your team for that you've shown on this issue. And thank you, everyone, for coming here today. Soon we are going to hear from some brave women who can tell you firsthand the importance of victims' rights. Through their experiences, we can learn about the impact crime has on our communities. I was a small-town newspaper editor for years, and I saw the justice system and how it impacts victims. Even with the credible law enforcement personnel and victim rights advocates working on behalf of victims in Wisconsin, we need a way to guarantee that people affected by violent crime were protected. In a small town, everybody knows everyone. The victim of a violent crime can feel trapped. These are the kinds of circumstances we can prevent with this bill. In Wisconsin, victims already have many rights, as Attorney General Schimel said. We are seeking to make sure that these rights are written clearly into the Constitution, not simply by state statute. For example, we are elevating the right to put victim restitution and payments ahead of any dollars owed to the government. Additionally, our bill is going to give a victim the constitutional right to have his or her voice heard at every significant point in the criminal justice process, including release, plea, and sentencing proceedings. I look forward to leading the change for constitutional rights for victims of crime, and I'm confident we will succeed. Their voices need to be heard, and they will be heard. Now I'd like to introduce Senator Van Weingard, who I'm proud to be working with as the Senate lead.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome. I think the Lord put my feet on a path to the state legislature to do things like this. 30 years of law enforcement experience and thousands of victims that I interacted with on my watch as a law enforcement officer helped guide me to see the importance of this legislation. You will hear from Terry Jandusa Nikolai in a minute, who's become an awesome friend of mine from the issue that she had that nearly took her life, albeit for law enforcement Sheriff Schmaling, who's here today, and he'll tell a little bit about that story. This is really important. This is about including victims in our Constitution. When I ended my career after a fleeing fugitive hit the front of my squad car during a high-speed chase, that ended my law enforcement career, and I became a victim of a felon. And when I got into that victim witness system, I was amazed at how awesome our victim witness program was, but what the need was. And what victims didn't have for insurance is that they would get that type of aid and that type of help that they needed. So I'm proud to be here today with my colleagues. Todd, Attorney General Schimel, he has just been a true advocate for what we need to do to make sure that our victims are protected too. So with that, I would like to introduce Terry Jandusa Nikolai. She's just an awesome lady, and if you have not seen her historical presentation about her case, you should, because it really tells from the heart what these victims go through. So with that, I'd like to call Terry up to the stand. Thanks for being strong.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to all these people behind me who are making things like this possible for victims across our state. If you haven't heard my story, long story short, 2004, I went to my ex-husband's home to pick up my children because we had joint custody at the time, and I was ambushed with a baseball bat, beaten, suffocated, stuffed in a garbage can, and driven to a storage locker to die in the freezing cold. By the grace of God and by the help of the Racine County Sheriff's Department and many law enforcement agencies across 2 states, I was found an hour before death. Lost the child I was carrying, lost all 10 of my toes, but gained a lot of perspective and gained a lot of knowledge and what things needed to be changed and what we can do to help victims going forward. Wisconsin has been fantastic. Over the past 10 years, I have testified for numerous laws that we passed to help victims of crime, especially domestic violence. And the SAFE Act has been one of them that we've recently got through. A lot of things have changed. Act 130, I believe, was something that changed right after my story came out. And it talks about judges taking a look at violence in marriages before they just blanket joint custody to moms and dads. So we've come a long way. We truly have, but there's still work to do. There's always work to do. And I believe that this will really help victims. I think it's going to help them come forward. I think it's going to help them get out of the situation, and it's going to help them through the court system. My story, it was about 13, 14 years ago now, and I'm still dealing with my ex who's in prison, who was still trying to harass me using all of his rights, all of his constitutional rights, appeals, and crazy things like asking the judge to give him joint custody, to have my daughters go to prison to visit him, goofy things like that. It never stops. It seems like their rights never cease. It's about time we step up and give the victims equal rights. And I really appreciate the support I have behind me and in front of me, and I ask the support of all our constituents across the state to get this in our Constitution for these victims and for the entire community. And I would like to introduce my friend Christina, who will tell you her story.
So my name is Christina Traub, and on August 12th, 2015, I became a crime victim. And going over the events that happened that night, a person can come up with a lot of different questions, but I have 2 questions for everyone here today. And the first question would be that, why is it that the man who put his hands around my neck, looked me in the eye and squeezed as hard as he could, why does this man deserve rights that are backed by the Wisconsin State Constitution, and I do not? Why is it that the same man that dragged me by the neck over to a sidewalk and smashed my head into the curb, why is it that this man has the right to speak at many different points during the legal process, but my statement was only given during sentencing? During this whole process, I felt like this whole thing that happened to me, that I wasn't really a part of it. And the biggest reason we were even there is because what happened to me. And that was my story to tell. And I felt that it was much more focused on what his story was and what he had to share. As we've mentioned before, Wisconsin is very progressive with victims' rights, and I definitely appreciate what has been in place and what that has meant for me. And law enforcement was incredibly supportive for me during the process, especially that night in the hospital. But my case is definitely something that can show you that we do have strides to make. If the statutes were strong enough, if victims' rights were strong enough, then perhaps his first victim that also went through the court process would have felt more empowered to come forward and go to the hearings that she didn't feel comfortable making an appearance at. Perhaps then the second victim that he had, who was beaten and strangled for the course of a year, would have thought maybe her story would have been believed over his when speaking to police officers. And then ultimately, maybe I wouldn't be here, which, I'm grateful to be here and share my story with everyone. But Marsy's Law is really, as Terry was saying, a minor part in helping victims. But I think the major part is that it's going to change the perception that a victim is somehow less than the accused. And when you don't have equal rights with the person that hurt you so violently and changed your life really, it does make you feel like less of a person, like less important. And obviously we want to show people that it's not their fault and they didn't choose to be a victim. So like I said, I didn't ask to be a victim, but what I'm going to ask everybody is to support Marsy's Law so that future victims, and let's be honest here, there's going to be many more regardless of what we do, but that they feel that they have a right to speak, that they have rights to understand what's going on in the process and what that means for them. So thank you again, everybody, for being here and for everyone that's supportive. And I'd like to introduce Racine County Sheriff Chris Schmeling.
Good morning, everyone. It is certainly a pleasure to be here, and it's great to see all the wonderful support that we have in this room and behind me, especially our Attorney General, our state representative and state senators, and our two brave victims here today to talk about what they had went through with their ordeal. My name is Christopher Schmeling. I'm the sheriff in Racine County. I have been in law enforcement for 22 years, and I have unfortunately had to deal with more victims of crime than I care to talk to. Many of these stories would simply break your heart. And I cannot begin to tell you how many times when I sat down and talked with victims of crime, to hear them to relive their stories here today before this community is disheartening. And to hear that it always appears that the suspect would have more rights than they would. And from a law enforcement perspective, it was always challenging, and it's nothing more disheartening when we meet with victims of crime, whether it be at a living room setting or in a hospital or in a courtroom, to have to hear the same complaints from victims. And from a law enforcement perspective, having to walk away knowing that we should be or we could be doing more. And upon examining Marsy's Law for everyone, I feel that we could accomplish that. And I would like to read with you a quote from Marsy's Law. This is a quote: "To ensure that crime victims' rights and interests are respected and protected by law in a manner no less vigorous than the protections afforded to criminal defendants." Now, if that doesn't sum up why we're all here today, I don't know what does. Again, I speak about the hearing and the seeing of crime victims, the victims' frustration, nervousness, frightfulness, perhaps even being afraid to go home to their own house where they should have some level of sense of security from the unknown. The feeling of threatened or intimidation, and as if no one cares or if no one is hearing their voice. Marsy's Law for everyone would be an empowering set of victim tools that we can all feel good and know that we can and will do more for victims in the state of Wisconsin. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Sheriff. With that, we'll take any questions you might have.
So from a prosecutor's perspective, does this make your job easier? Does it change your job in any respect?
It might actually make the prosecutor's job a little more complicated because we become used to really the only time that we had to anticipate the crime victim coming forward is at sentencing time. But now if we make this change to Wisconsin law, we'll have to accommodate them being present in the courtroom at any critical stage of the proceedings, and we should take on that responsibility. It's absolutely the right thing to do. But beyond that, many of the rights we're talking about, we're working hard as a criminal justice system to ensure those rights anyway. We're talking about elevating things, though, from a statutory right to a constitutional right for crime victims.
I talked to some defense attorneys who were concerned in particular about the provision that would allow a victim to refuse to provide discovery. And there was a case of somebody who has a cell phone that might have critical evidence that could help prove the innocence of someone who's accused of a crime. What would your response to them say as to why a victim should be able to not turn over material to the counsel for a defendant?
Well, if counsel for the defense has information they want to obtain from a crime victim, they should work through the prosecutor or through the law enforcement agency. We can do that, but any time government interviews any person, that's a voluntary interview. No one has to talk to us ever. And the same should be true for a crime victim. They should not feel compelled that they must speak with a defendant's attorney or investigator. If there's information that is critical to the defense that would ensure that the defendant gets a fair trial, then the criminal justice system through the court will make sure that that evidence is sought. And it can be the case that if there is information that would be exculpatory and we're not able to get that can affect our ability to proceed forward. But we shouldn't do this by trampling over the rights of the victim.
In states like Montana and North Dakota, there have been concerns about the public records aspect of this in terms of information being released related to victims potentially harassed. Do those protections already exist in Wisconsin? Are there changes within this that relate to that?
Well, we do have some protections in Wisconsin for victims. We just on Saturday, Safe at Home went into effect for victims of sexual abuse, domestic violence, trafficking, stalking. Victims of those offenses can seek to have address confidentiality, and we have a whole process in place now that we administer at the Department of Justice for this. So we do have those kinds of things in place already. Prosecutors will, in cases where there's a danger to a victim, when releasing their identity would cause undue embarrassment, when it would involve a sensitive crime like a sexual assault, we already take steps to somehow mask their identity when we file charges. The defendant would, of course, be entitled to know, and their attorney would be entitled to know the information, but we don't always release it to the public. So we do have those kinds of protections in place. Marsy's law for Wisconsin would create for victims, though, a constitutional right to that privacy that we can't ignore that, and we shouldn't.
If this goes through, do you foresee having to increase the number of people on staff for crime victim services?
I don't. I think in the DA's office, like I said, with almost everything in Marsy's law, that's already either constitutional or statutory in Wisconsin. So we're already working to protect and enforce those rights on behalf of victims. There may be some more time in the courtroom, but I'm not really sure there would be, because ultimately we're really not talking about giving new rights to crime victims. We're talking about the stature that those rights receive in the courtroom. I'll give you an example. A judge always has to weigh the defendant's right to a fair trial. And the state has a right to a fair trial too, by the way. But we've become, as the government, we expect that our right to a fair trial is a little less significant than the defendant's right to a fair trial. So for instance, sometimes witnesses can be excluded from the courtroom because they're going to be a future witness, so they can't be there when other witnesses testify. We'll look at the situation where you have a child victim of sexual assault, for instance, and mom's going to be a witness, but mom's, pretty predictably going to be that child support mechanism. Right now, when a judge weighs, when a defendant claims that witness, that mom should be excluded, should not be able to be in the courtroom while her daughter testifies, the judge looks at that, and that's the defendant's constitutional right. The victim has a statutory right to have that support person in the courtroom with them. If we elevate the victim's rights to constitutional nature, the judge can now weigh their right more heavily. The defendant's right to a fair trial will trump all the circumstances there. However, right now, and I faced this situation in trials I prosecuted, the judge really had no choice. And as a prosecutor, I didn't push the judge, because if we let that mom stay in the courtroom, the defendant's constitutional right would trump the victim's statutory right, and that created an appeal issue. We didn't want to create that appeal issue. When we equalize those rights more, we make that appeal issue less frightening, and it's something the judge can weigh more heavily in deciding whether that child should testify. I've had, in sexual assault trials I've prosecuted, I've had kids as young as 4, 5, and 6 get on the witness stand in front of a jury and a whole courtroom full of people. And the idea of asking them to do that without a parent in that courtroom to be supportive for them, it's unconscionable. But I've been in the position where they've had to do it. Mom has had to leave the courtroom, that child had to go to the witness stand, and that judge had no choice but to protect the record on appeal. We can make that record more bulletproof on appeal if the judge makes a decision that the defendant's right is not compromised. His right to a fair trial is not significantly compromised.
Does this do anything to expand who these protections are afforded to? Does it extend to victims' family members or anything?
It really doesn't change the definition of who qualifies as a victim under Wisconsin law. We already reach, when it's a child victim, their parent or guardian qualifies for the rights. When it's a deceased victim, then their family members have a right to be heard. So we're already expand that beyond just the individual who was directly affected. All right, they're all directly affected. I didn't say that right, but the physically affected, perhaps.
Henry Nicholas, who's involved with Marsy's Lodge, whose sister was Marsy, is helping fund the effort to roll this out. He was charged with pretty serious crimes a decade ago. Those charges were dismissed. Do you have any concerns about working with or being affiliated with him?
No, as I understand, there is that Dr. Nicholas is involved in funding this effort in some way. That funding isn't going to the Department of Justice or any other state entity that I'm aware of. It's simply to engage individuals who are helping to promote this effort. So I don't have any concerns with whatever his past is, and as you noted, the charges were dismissed. I really I don't know anything much about the background of that, but I'm not concerned that he's funding efforts to try to help
Time for
this.
one more question, guys. All right, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.